On October 28, 1962, Fidel Castro learned that the missiles were leaving his island. Not from Moscow, not from a phone call from Khrushchev, from the radio. The Soviet premier had announced the withdrawal to the world without a single word to the man whose country had just been traded away. The deal was done. The revolution had been sold. The Crisis de Octubre did not begin in October. It began 3 years earlier, on the first day of January 1959. Fulgencio Batista, dictator, American ally, casino landlord, fled the country before dawn. The rebels marched into Havana, and for the first time in 400 years, since the Spanish planted a flag in the soil, Cuba belonged to Cubans. It lasted about 15 months before Washington decided that was a problem. The Bay of Pigs invasion. April 1961. 1,500 CIA-trained exiles landed at the Bay of Cachinos. The plan was to spark a national uprising. The uprising never came. Within 3 days, the invasion force was destroyed, captured, paraded before the world. Castro had survived, but he knew he would not survive the next one, and the next one was coming. Operation Mongoose. Operation Ortsac, Castro spelled backward. The Kennedy administration ran sabotage operations, assassination plots, economic warfare, invasion planning that would eventually call for 180,000 American troops. Castro did what any leader facing annihilation would do. He asked for help. The Soviet Union said yes. Nikita Khrushchev had his own reasons. American Jupiter missiles in Turkey, just across the Black Sea from Soviet territory, sat armed and aimed at Moscow since 1961. To Khrushchev, Cuba was reciprocity, put American cities in the crosshairs the way Soviet cities already were. But to Cuba, this was not about balance. This was about survival. 7 million people, an island 90 miles from Florida, preparing to die. The history they teach you says the missile crisis began on October 16, 1962, when a U-2 spy plane photographed Soviet missile launch sites under construction in western Cuba. This is true, but only if you were sitting in the White House Situation Room. If you were in Havana, the crisis had already been building for 18 months. And when the missiles arrived, Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles, each capable of hitting Washington, D.C. in 13 minutes, Cubans were told, this is our defense. This is what keeps the Americans out. What almost nobody knew, what the Americans did not know until decades later, was that the Soviets had done far more than place big missiles on the island. They had shipped 162 nuclear warheads to Cuba, short-range tactical nuclear weapons, nuclear depth charges for their submarines, warheads that could destroy the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay, warheads that Soviet field commanders in Cuba had the authority to use without consulting Moscow if the Americans invaded. 162. Kennedy had the Situation Room, Khrushchev had the Kremlin, Castro had a bunker, and 7 million Cubans, sugarcane cutters and school teachers and university students handed rifles for the first time, had nothing but the radio and the dark. For 13 days, the world held its breath. And on October 26, 1962, deep inside his bunker, Fidel Castro sat down and wrote a letter. The letter is now known as the Armageddon Letter. Castro addressed it to Khrushchev. He had become convinced, from Cuban intelligence, from the American fleet massing offshore, from everything he could see, that a U.S. invasion was coming within 24 hours. His message was unambiguous. He urged Khrushchev to launch a preemptive nuclear strike against the United States if Cuba was invaded. Quote, if the imperialists invade Cuba with the goal of occupying it, the danger that aggressive policy poses for humanity is so great that following that event, the Soviet Union must never allow the circumstances in which the imperialists could launch the first nuclear strike against it. What he was saying, if they attack us, destroy them. The letter arrived in Moscow, and Khrushchev was, in his own words, completely aghast. He understood what Castro did not, that if the Soviets launched a nuclear strike, even a retaliatory one, Cuba would be the first to vanish from the face of the earth. And after Cuba, the missiles would fly everywhere. After all, Khrushchev later said, millions of people would die, in our country too. Can we even contemplate such a thing? The letter was set aside. On the night of October 27th, while Castro sat in his bunker waiting for a response he would never receive, 2 men met in Washington. Robert Kennedy, the president's brother, Anatoly Dobrynin, the Soviet ambassador. In a private room at the Justice Department, they cut a deal. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba. The Americans would secretly remove their Jupiter missiles from Turkey. No announcement, no acknowledgement. The Turkey withdrawal would remain hidden from the public for nearly 30 years. And in return, Kennedy would guarantee that the United States would not invade Cuba. Everything Castro had asked for and nothing. 2 men, 2 superpowers, 1 island. And the island was not invited to its own negotiation. A British diplomat stationed in Havana, Ambassador Herbert Marchant, later wrote words that should be engraved in history books. To discover in the early stages of an 18-round contest that you are not even one of the contestants, but only the prize money, is not an easily forgotten experience for a sensitive young nation. The prize money. And then, on the morning of October 28, 1962, Radio Moscow began broadcasting. Nikita Khrushchev had written a letter to John F. Kennedy. The letter was read aloud over the airwaves simultaneously, in Russian, in English, to the entire world. Soviet government has ordered the dismantling of arms in Cuba. The crisis is ended. Khrushchev agrees to withdraw missiles. The whole world heard it at once. The whole world except the man whose country it was about. Khrushchev did not call Havana. He did not send a diplomat. He did not wake Castro in the night to tell him the missiles were leaving. A man who had survived the Bay of Pigs, a man who had faced down an empire, a man who had bet his revolution on Soviet protection. He found out from the radio, like everyone else. 3 decades later at a conference in Havana, Castro described what he felt in that moment. Not relief, not gratitude. A great indignation, he said, the humiliation. He had written to Khrushchev urging nuclear war if Cuba was invaded. He had been willing to die for his revolution, and the men in Moscow had traded it away without a word. The missiles, the warheads, the bombers, the Soviet troops, all leaving. And Cuba? Cuba was handed back its island without ever being asked if it wanted it. The deal was done. The missiles came out. The American Jupiter missiles in Turkey came out, quietly, without acknowledgement, as if they had never been there. And the world called it Kennedy's finest hour. And Cuba?